Hello, everybody. Super nice to be here. My name is Anrick, and I'm a writer and director. I thought that the previous talk by Marie was super inspiring. It's something that actually touches my work quite a lot, but it is often not something that we consider enough. So I'm definitely taking some lessons away with me from that. Really quick intro, my background, I'm actually from the Netherlands. I'm Dutch born. I grew up in Swaziland, and I live in London in the UK. I've been there for quite a long time. I come here quite often, but I'm actually from Holland. In Holland, I live in London. And I work with a network of creative people all over the world, so I tend to do a lot of my working remotely, which adds another layer of complexity. And it is interesting, but also is very valuable. You get to take in a lot of the talented people that happen to not be near you. I work with a production company called Unit 9, who make a lot of film, installation-based work, and VR and AR. I have done work elsewhere. I've worked quite a lot with the Guardian VR team. You'll see some of that work coming up in a second. And I've worked with RGA, the UN, PBS in the States. So I have floated around quite a bit. And one of the things that I'm very interested in my work, and I try to explore in every way that I can, is the borders between real and virtual. I think that from a technical perspective, those borders are kind of disappearing. And in terms of the experiences that we have, just as human beings in the world, the virtual side of our experiences, the virtual lives that we have is gaining in prominence. And that's mirroring, I think, a little bit what social networking has done in the past. Ultimately, I think what I'm really fascinated by, and I try to bring into the work that I do, and hope to do much more of that in the future, is creating virtual memories. The idea that the virtual version of you is persistently present in your life, and that you dip in and out of the two sides. I've got a few projects to show you guys, and I've kind of grouped them together into these three different categories. The first one is transforming our view of the real world. I think all of you will have been aware of, to some degree, of journalism and virtual reality, and increasingly now augmented reality. I've definitely worked quite a bit in that space, in particular with the Guardian team. I find it very interesting how a virtual experience can change the way that you see the real world, or change your perspective on the real world. Ultimately, if we design experiences that are tech agnostic, where the story itself is bigger than the technology, bigger than a feature of the technology, then it'll touch you in a way that's relevant to your life every day, even if you may not work with that technology. All stories really are bigger than the technology that we use. As a writer and as a director, I always begin purely with the narrative I'm trying to tell, rather than trying to fit it into a box. A couple of examples of that work. There's a project that I worked on with The Guardian called The Party. It's a cinematic virtual reality project. We worked together with Cambridge University and their research team, and this is a project about autism and what it's like on a daily basis to experience being autistic, and in particular in a social setting. So what kind of pressures do you get? What influences do you have? And how does that change the perspective going back into the world for an autistic person? In this experience, you meet somebody called Layla. She's the center of this story. You never see her because you see the world through her eyes, and you hear what she's thinking as the world around her changes and as pressure and tension increases. You hear her inner thoughts, and you can kind of begin to understand a little bit what she goes through, and hopefully understand a little bit more what that means for her as a person. We did about 20 hours of interviews. We brought in a whole range of people that have a particular perspective on autism, not necessarily all people who are autistic, but also people that are in the field and research, such as at Cambridge. And we asked everybody sort of the same questions. How do you prepare for a social event? What do you find most stressful about it? What goes through your head? What do you feel? What do you think when things are beginning to become stressful, when certain triggers are happening? And what could others do around you to help that situation? Ultimately, it's about sensory overload, which is really when stress levels get too high and you may not perceive things in the same way. It's very interesting, certainly for somebody like myself who's neurotypical, to begin to understand that that process of stress is a little bit
I don't
different.
think you didn't know I was autistic. So you put me in a birthday party setting. When I'm anxious, my brain flashes things at me.
It seems to build up and up and up. It's kind of like when you're in a tube stop and you know when the tube goes past really quickly.
A lot of different things happen, and I won't go into too much detail now, but I think one of the most surprising things for me, and that really made me understand a little bit what autism is like differently than I had thought about it before, are things like when stress becomes quite high, facial features, even if somebody that you might know well, like your father or your mother, become quite difficult to process. So the processes that happen in the brain in those moments of sensory overload are pretty complicated, and that's really what the film tries to explore. And ultimately, I think it's about understanding neurodiversity a little bit better. I think we really understand that idea of what that process is like, what that stress is like in the wrong way, and hopefully this film is a small part of changing that. Another project that is dealing with a similar theme, not in terms of story, but in terms of changing your perspective on the world is Crime Scene. Quite a different project. It's technically a volumetric scanned experience, so it's more like a game. We built it together with the Guardian and Google Daydream team. And it's really about what happens on a crime scene, what really happens on a crime scene, right, as opposed to what you see on the TV and in the movies. And so we spent quite a bit of time with forensic scientists, understanding the things that they learn and the things that they go through, and what becomes important in the process of forensic science, or in other words, dissecting a crime scene. And in particular, what was very interesting for me is the idea that you do one thing wrong, you might be the first person on that set, on that crime scene, and you can do one or two things wrong, and that'll have a massive impact, if not a decisive impact later when the actual trial might take place. It could be a deal breaker for a trial. In this experience, you are a rookie forensic scientist.
Hey, hello? Can you hear me? Sorry, this line is terrible. Ah, there you are. It's Louise. I'm the crime scene officer on duty tonight. I'm stuck on another job, I'm afraid, so you have to do this one by yourself. Your controller lets you move. To start examining the room, aim and click at the floor. The victim's name is Mark, and the police have confirmed he lives here. He's a known drug dealer. Firstly, let's get this room better lit. Click and point at the floodlights by the body to turn the scene lights on.
That's just a very intro, and then you have about a 10-minute experience where you slowly take steps to break down what happened in this particular scenario, and how you can uncover really who took someone's life. There were quite a lot of interesting UX challenges here. This is just one example of how you might explore fibers that have been left by the killer on the body. But yeah, there's a range of those. And then the audio side of it is valuable, just because that gives you the narrative layer and the understanding, all those different steps that you are supposed to take and all the care that you have to take in terms of processing information. And we worked with the Metropolitan Police in London to really map out that script, that scenario, to try to create an accurate representation of forensic science. Ultimately, I think the lesson and takeaway for me for this project was to give people a mission, allow them to be free to explore from a UX perspective in terms of design. And then at the end, the satisfying moment, I think, is comparing your experience of that scene with the reality of what might happen really much later. We give you an overview at the end, a conclusion of what happened in this trial and what ended up having happened on that crime scene. We scanned this with LiDAR scanners, so we really built the set and had an actor who lay down for probably about 4 hours in a pool of fake blood in order for that whole scene to become a volumetric space that you can explore in your own time. Another layer of the narrative of how the borders between real and virtual are merging is team skills and tools. For me, it's particularly interesting as a director. I work with a lot of people that have either experiences in one or the other, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means specifically with virtual and real. And merging those teams is quite an interesting process. I'll tell you a little bit about this particular project that we did with SEAT in Barcelona, and in particular why this is interesting for me as a director, because I think insecurity as a creativity tool is really a killer to the process until you accept that chaos happens. And when you put teams that have very different experiences and very different ideas of how processes should work together, that particular issue becomes a problem. It can be a blocker. SEAT's a haptic 4D virtual reality film. We made that with Unit 9, and we filmed it in Barcelona using a whole range of different technologies, drones, 360 cameras, and ultimately allowed for people to sit in a chair and move with the camera physically as it's traveling through the most famous places of Barcelona in a kind of like car chase experience. So again, in terms of bringing this project together, there are two very different teams that work here. There are teams that understand the virtual reality part, the experience, making that comfortable, allowing people to experience this sense of movement and intensity without getting sick, for example. And then there are very traditional teams that have done films and commercials for many years. And those two teams operate very differently. So gelling them together and creating a communication level, a flow in terms of production was one of the fun and interesting challenges. It's something that I face very often, kind of having one foot in the live action and one foot in the game engine or in the more digital space. And it's key because when you shoot something on set, you won't be able to change it later. This is a lot of the work that we went into erasing the cameraman who was filming the skateboarder. Things are set in stone, and at the same time, you don't yet know what the output's going to be, how it's going to work. Innovation versus experience, in essence. And again, the same thing here. Huge number of unknowns in terms of making it something really quite straightforward, a drone flying past somebody with a jet ski. So planning that up front and trying to create a sense of how that might play out was an interesting challenge. It creates a creative flow where everybody really gets past the chaos, in essence. Another project that deals with similar challenges, that had similar challenges of very diverse skills and processes is Sea Prayer. It's a tilt brush experience made with The Guardian and UNHCR. And it's really about Syria. It's an interesting story. It's very different from Sayat, clearly. It's a father's goodbye to a son at the eve of the son traveling over the Mediterranean. And trying to imagine what that journey might be like for his son, and possibly that journey having a very bad ending. It was written by Khaled Hosseini, who's the author of The Kite Runner, A Thousand Splendid Suns. And his words really were the beginning of this journey of creating something that visualizes that. He wrote a long letter, just imagining what he'd say to his son in the letter he'd give to his son as that journey starts. And it deals with both happy memories and quite scary ones of what's really happening in Syria and has been happening over the last years. We started looking at early sketches based on his words and just mapping out essentially a 360 canvas, a journey all around you that slowly visualizes or becomes visual as the narrative plays out. The whole illustration in tilt brush was probably done 30, 40 times, and it took about 2 hours each time. At the core, for me, what's really attractive about this story, or really powerful about this story, is how it elevates a human element over the numbers that we often hear related to that particular topic that's in the news very often, or more broadly, generally, elevating the human story over the numbers. Ultimately, that early test became color. We didn't really know how the output would work. This became a 360 motion graphic process at the end that was fairly intensive. We spent a lot of time experimenting, testing, and trying different techniques in order to get that 360 illustration into a format so as many people as possible could watch it. Both those projects, Sayat and Sea Prayer, really benefited from not necessarily the fail fast philosophy, which you hear often in startup culture, and it's true. I think that you grow very often as a team when you might fail, and so that pressure is very high. But what I try to do with my teams, and that's true for the traditional film teams and the interactive teams or motion teams, design teams, is to spend as much time as possible up front thinking about everything that could go wrong. To research and research again and then research again, and really fight for time to have that space in the beginning. To not just take a few steps, but to take almost all the steps you might take later in the full production. New technology like VR is often a bad excuse not to do that. You might say, oh, it's all new, we don't really know. How could we know? But if you really, really research, at least half of the time, you might not fail and you'll still learn. And then finally, as the borders between the real and the virtual are blending, it's even more important for experimentation. I spend quite a bit of time on this. I hope every month or so to have about 30% of my work time free to experiment and to develop projects that I can put out there for maybe not necessarily very specific reasons. I'll go through a couple of those just very briefly. Rock is one that we released recently. It's a daydream combination between live action and CGI. We took a 360 drone over to Ireland and spent about 3 days filming landscapes with a drone flying through them, and then we built on top of that a web VR fairy tale. So essentially 360 drone footage together with a CGI character. We had Simon Callow, who's an awesome Shakespearean actor in London, worked with us on the voice of our character. And then we built that raven that you just saw briefly as an early preview out into a 3D character and mapped it into the live action footage. It's really a story about the mythology of rock. Rock is an old mythological story. I remember hearing that story even as a kid, and it was interesting to explore. And ultimately, you can experience this through the browser, either with a Google Daydream or with your phone or with your laptop, and a whole range of different devices. It's a story about the memories you may have of you at your greatest moment. Just a quick view of what that looks like ultimately. And then interactively, as you experience this, using the Daydream, if you have a controller, you draw these shapes, you draw these shapes throughout the journey in order to complete and get all of your points. Sansar is a social VR platform. I've worked quite a bit with Sansar. I'm working on another project at the moment, which I think I'm going to release in a few months. It's really awesome. If you have a headset at home, an Oculus or a Vive, play with Sansar. It's a lot of fun. One of the things that I built is an old sort of strange, abstract, monkey temple type place of worship. And what happens in Sansar is everybody from the world can drop in. Doesn't really matter where you are or what you look like. In particular in Sansar, people have all kinds of, this is actually pretty safe image. At the time that I spent in Sansar, people come in all shapes, triangles, giant blue Smurfs, miniature raccoons. It's a lot of fun, and in particular, the connection between people all over the world really shrinks very quickly. And finally, Symphony of Sound is a prototype stage project that isn't finished yet. And so you'll see a couple of images here. It's UpCreative and close and co-collaboration between them and me. And essentially, this is a project together with a musician called Matthew Herbert, who uses found sounds and found music and collects them and creates music out of that. And so we're creating a lot of environments where you can discover audio and mix them together inside of virtual reality in a room scale space. And it's based on Matthew Herbert's poetry, which is really fairly abstract. It's been very interesting as a challenge to try to build visuals, again, visuals that reflect those words and those images that he just has to write on the page and try to make that journey feel logical and interesting and challenging at the same time. Prototype, so we really only spend a small amount of time. We'll develop that world a lot more in detail as we go forward and try to get it funded. I think with the experiments, what's interesting to me always is you don't necessarily always know what you're looking for. An open-ended design process, to me, has always been very valuable. It takes a lot of time and effort and investment, but ultimately you end up with super interesting, surprising results as a result of not specifically being so goal-oriented at the start. So the themes all collect into some thoughts that I take forward into the future. I think the virtual experiences that we're having are really, at least for me, increasingly connected to the real. Those two are blending quite quickly, and I think, as opposed to in the past, in a lot of these experiences that I've made, where you drop into something, a world, and learn something, and then maybe go out again, those connections are now becoming a little bit more strong. And so it's interesting for me to think about designing virtual memories, experiences that stay with you over time, and that might, much later, feel like a real memory to you. If I think back over my life, things have happened that I've taken with me as lessons, or I've taken with me as things that I just think are either funny or embarrassing or became important and shaped me in terms of who I am. And having those kind of memories and carrying those memories with you over time in the virtual space is a really powerful idea. It might create behavioral change as a result of the experiences that you have. I formed a research studio as a result of that with some funding, and really hope to explore that more. We're working on a project at the moment called Drift, which is really about a connection with somebody who's living in 25 years. This project is at the early writing stages, so not much to show yet, but we are working on ways in which those connections between the 25-year timelines can be created with these augmented reality puzzles, and what information you can learn from that. This project is about climate change and what happens over 25 years from today going forwards. These early experiments already exist today, but we'll be doing a lot more work coming forward in the future. Follow us as we develop this project from scratch. It's a world-building project, so I'll be expanding that quite a bit over time. I think that virtual reality, augmented and mixed reality expand our human abilities. I'm hoping with my work going forward, and I'm hoping everybody that is inspired to do work in this space does it to add some value to the world. Thank you.